actual shirt that I wore when I worked there for
2 years. Now, I mean, the job had obvious perks. Oh, would you look at that? Just like these right here. With the pay? Oh, sorry, hold on. The pay? That wasn't so great. This is great. Minimum wage is the absolute lowest wage that the law allows a business to pay a worker. Nationally, the US government has that set at a number of $7.25 an hour, and it's been that way for 10 years. But my job was in Oakland, California, which passed its own minimum wage law, so I got $12.25 an hour.
Some people argue against increasing the federal minimum wage and say the state should set the minimum wage because of the cost of living varies from state to state. But that's sort of a red herring. The issue with the minimum wage is labor productivity. So if your labor is $9 an hour, has a market value of $9 an hour, and the minimum wage is $12.25 an hour, then you're priced out of the marketplace. And that's true regardless of what the cost of living is in the area that you're living. In fact, somebody in a high cost of living area needs employment more, all other things being equal, than somebody in a lower cost of living, because it's more expensive to live there. So they're even harder hit by being unemployed because of the minimum wage. So this is the real the real focus of the minimum wage should be it prices people out of the marketplace. The minimum wage doesn't raise wages. And this is something that basically nobody gets, okay? But raising the minimum wage doesn't raise anybody's wages. The people who remain employed after the minimum wage was increased are people who would have been employed at this rate anyway. Very few people make the minimum wage. Most of the labor force makes more than the minimum wage. So if you set the minimum wage to $15 an hour, the guy who's making $10 an hour doesn't get a 50% increase in his salary. Instead, the firm just hires somebody whose labor is worth $15 an hour.
So if I got paid $5 an hour more than the federal minimum wage, isn't that a good thing? Well, Oakland is part of the Bay Area, which is one of the most expensive places in the entire country. I'm talking $7 coffees and $1,500 a month to rent a bedroom. No, not an apartment, the bedroom. No kitchen, no living room, just one room with 4 other people also renting a room. That's crazy. That's why I still live with my mom. Thanks, Mom. Now, if I had that same job at a donut shop in, say, Houston, Texas, I'd be getting $7.25 an hour because that's what the minimum wage is there. And that brings us to the never-ending minimum wage debate. Some think $7.25 an hour is way too low to survive on no matter where you live, even if where you live is cheap. They want to raise it to $15 an hour, so no matter what city or state you work in, you can't make less than that. Others think that the minimum wage isn't designed for people to survive on. It's supposed to be an entry-level wage for workers with no skills to get a foot in the door, gain skills, and then quickly move on to higher-paying jobs. Raising it could force businesses to fire workers and raise their prices.
So businesses can't really raise their prices. Their prices are already set to maximize total revenue. If they could raise their prices after the minimum wage was increased, they could have raised them before. The prices are determined by supply and demand. But yeah, it could cause businesses to fire workers or to not hire workers, or to hire more skilled workers at a higher rate, or at the new minimum wage rate, whereas before they might have hired less skilled workers at the old rate.
Which could hurt the economy. So, should the US raise the federal minimum wage?
No.
The reason people are talking about the minimum wage today is because of what happened 7 years ago in late 2012. Hundreds of fast food workers in New York City walked off their jobs, demanding better pay. The reason? Minimum wage wasn't enough to get by on. Those strikes snowballed into the
Yeah, pretty sure nobody cared about that.
Fight for 15 movement, which went national and pushed to raise the federal minimum wage from $7.25 an hour
The Fight for 15 movement's pretty big.
to $15 an hour. Democrats in the House of Representatives took notice. They recently passed a bill that would raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour by 2024. But Republicans in
They've already done that in Ontario.
the Senate have no plans on taking up the bill. And President Trump has threatened to veto it if it ever does pass. So it pretty much has zero chance of passing right now.
Base Trump.
But if you really want to understand the minimum wage debate, you gotta go back even earlier to the late 1800s. Historians called it the Gilded Age. Business was booming, but there was massive inequality. Almost all the money was going to the people at the top, dudes with top hats and monocles.
Citation needed. While the conventional view of the Gilded Age is one of robber barons and inequality, some economists, such as Richard Such, have argued it was one of the most equal periods of wealth distribution in American economic history. You gotta understand that this was just the beginning of large-scale enterprise, at least in the manufacturing sector. Up until this time, like small craftsmen had dominated industry in America.
Who own the railroads and most of the businesses and Boardwalk and Park Place. And we all know you just can't win when someone owns Boardwalk and Park Place. Basically, these guys had all the power and didn't pay their workers well at all. In 1890, the average American made
Actually, 380 a year, or I was just about to say 11,000 in today's dollars, is pretty good considering this was 150 years ago, 140 years ago, 30 years ago. That's a long time, and there's been a lot of progress since then. Wages naturally increased over time as the economy becomes more productive, workers become more productive through capital accumulation and new technology and more efficient manufacturing processes. Furthermore, if you look at average industrial workers' salaries in 1890, they were more like $564. What's more, that was a 60% increase from the last decade. So not only were wages pretty high, all things considered, they were going up very, very quickly, and that's without a minimum wage to push them up. Now, certainly there was a lot of poverty during the Gilded Age. It was 140 years ago. There was a lot of poverty everywhere, but things were improving very quickly because of laissez-faire capitalism, because when you don't have government intervention in the economy, there's a massive engine of wealth creation in the market economy. People are reinvesting the money they make into new enterprises and expanding enterprises, and this generates an insane amount of prosperity.
a year. That's $11,000 in 2019 dollars. That could get you what? Maybe 3 months worth of rent in San Francisco? Maybe. When the Great Depression
Yeah, but that's the most expensive area in the country. I mean, that'll get you like 3 years in certain places.
hit in the 1930s, President Franklin D. Roosevelt wanted to do something about inequality. In 1938, Roosevelt signed the Fair Labor Standards Act, which set the first ever national minimum wage at 25 cents an hour, which would equal about $4.45 today.
Sorry I'm late. I had to stop by the Wax Museum again and give the finger to FDR.
22 times. The current level of $7.25 was last set in 2009 when President Obama signed it into law. And that's what makes the minimum wage debate in the U.S. different. Many other countries tie the minimum wage to inflation. See, as time passes, money is worth less.
It's not like a fact of life or anything. In fact, the Gilded Age that we were just talking about was a period of steady deflation. Prices are dropping about 1.5% per annum. Another factor that helped with inequality. But yes, inflation is basically a fact of life because the government is printing money and robbing people's savings through inflation.
$100 in 1900 could buy way more than $100 could today. So tying minimum wage to inflation means that it increases automatically every year or two so that it doesn't lose its value.
Yeah, well, the problem is, first of all, the minimum wage is a bad thing. It doesn't help anybody. It just prices people out of the marketplace. So it shouldn't exist at all. But secondly, if you tie it to inflation, then we lose, at least if it's not tied to inflation, they have to go about doing it. That gets in the media, and at least we can have this discussion again. You know, you tie it to inflation, and then it's there, it's happening. Nobody's going to even talk about it. So at least we can talk about it because it's a big problem that people don't realize the negative effects of it.
The U.S. requires a new law every time to raise the minimum wage. That means the House, Senate, and the President all have to sign off on it, and they don't agree on stuff that often. That's why we have the same minimum wage we've had for the last 10 years. And over that time, it's lost 16% of its value. That $7.25 an hour is now worth $6.10 an hour. Now, here's where things get a little complicated. States, counties, and even cities can pass laws to set their own minimum wage. It just has to be equal to or greater than the federal minimum wage. For example, in California, it's $12 an hour, but in the city of San Francisco, it's over 15. Looking at the country as a whole, 21 states have a minimum wage of $7.25 an hour. But in the other 29 states plus DC, there's a higher minimum wage. And then there are counties and cities peppered throughout with their own minimum wages. For many supporters, raising the minimum wage is a basic issue of fairness in a society where income inequality keeps rising. They think
Well, this video pretends that it's sort of balanced coverage, covering it from all sides, but it's really pushing the pro minimum wage agenda. Like they're spending they make some cursory, oh, it might raise prices or something like that, you know, but they're really pushing the pro minimum wage. Very obvious.
putting more money in the pockets of low-wage workers is an effective way to reduce poverty. Let's look at
On the other hand, if they're unemployed because of the minimum wage, there's no money in their pocket, and that's a great way to cause poverty.
the numbers. $7.25 an hour works out to $58 a day.
Right? $0 an hour works out to $0 a day.
If you work 8 hours. So if you work 5 days a week, every week, nonstop for an entire year, you'd make a little over $15,000.
And if you make $0 an hour for the entire year, you make $0 in annual income. That's what the minimum wage does. It prices low-skilled workers out of the marketplace. The people who end up being employed at the new higher minimum wage are the same people with the skill set that would have commanded a wage rate at that rate anyway. Because not a lot of people make the minimum wage. Most people have skills that set them above the minimum wage.
Check out this poverty chart from the federal government. A worker supporting a family of 2 would be almost $2,000 below the poverty line.
Poverty line's meaningless. It's meaningless.
So, what happens if you raise their
It's just some arbitrary line somebody said somewhere.
wages to $15 an hour? A report from the Congressional Budget Office calculated that it would boost the pay of 27 million workers and it would lift 1.3 million people above the poverty line.
Nonsense.
It's also important to understand who the typical minimum wage worker is. An old stereotype is that they're mostly just teens in high school who need
No, the teens aren't working minimum wage. The teens don't have the skill set to get hired at the minimum wage. That's why teenage unemployment increased so substantially after the minimum wage was introduced. Not to mention, black teenage unemployment went up. Before the minimum wage, black teenage unemployment was slightly below white teenage unemployment. Afterwards, way higher. So this is a policy that disproportionately harms minorities.
a little extra spending cash. Now, it is true that teens make up a big chunk of minimum wage workers, but more than half are over 25. A lot of these workers make so little money that they qualify for some form of government assistance like food stamps or housing support. One study by the Economic Policy Institute found that for
That's actually better. Like, it's better. I mean, don't get me wrong. I'm anti-welfare. I'm anti-welfare state, okay? Full stop. But it's better that that people are working and getting some sort of assistance than just not working, getting total assistance, right? So people villainize companies for hiring people that their wages aren't enough, that they're still taking some government assistance. Well, that's the system working. That's what it's supposed to do. You know, it's not supposed to, like, that's a lot better, at least. You know, they're still trying to get out there and work and bust their ass, you know. Even if it is only for $7 an hour, whatever, that's the best they can find. Sometimes that's the best you can get. You know, the economy is not always that great, especially when you've got, you know, politicians that are spending so much money like crazy, running up debt. That's a drain on the economy, and sometimes there's not a lot of good jobs. So this is when the system's working, when they're working, they're getting some assistance from the government to push them up to a decent level, you know, but it's not as much a drain on the taxpayer, and at least they are working. They have that opportunity to increase their skill set and get some promotions and make a higher wage and become self-sufficient.
For every dollar the minimum wage is increased, spending on government assistance drops by 5.
Again, this is all of these calculations is predicated on the lie that raising the minimum wage raises wages, and it's a very easy fallacy. You know, it's very difficult to understand why this isn't the case. That's why, you know, because it's difficult to see why raising the minimum wage doesn't actually raise anybody's wages. But the employment process is dynamic, okay? Nobody has to hire any one particular person. No firm has to compose their labor force of any set manner. So, for example, okay, let's say there's this guy named Joe. He works at a widget factory. He makes 5 widgets an hour, and he gets paid $5 an hour, okay? His productivity is 5 widgets an hour. His salary is $5 an hour. So another guy, more experienced, better shape, he can make 10 widgets an hour. His salary, you guessed it, $10 an hour, okay? So the employer would be fine hiring the $5 an hour guy and his buddy who also makes $5 an hour, or for say 20 hours each, or hiring just the $10 an hour guy for 20 hours on his own, right? It's really no different to them, to the employer. They're getting the same amount of output and at the same cost. It's going to cost, you know, $200 either way. It doesn't make a difference. But if you set the minimum wage at $7, now if the employer were to hire the lower productivity guy, the guy who can only make 5 widgets an hour, he's going to overpay. His marginal labor cost goes up by 40%. So he's saving a lot of money by hiring the higher productivity worker. So he now, it makes a big difference, and he wants to compose his labor force of just the higher productivity labor to keep his marginal labor costs down.
$5.2 billion. So if companies had
So
to...
I challenge all those statistics. They're based on this false premise that raising the minimum wage raises wages. It does not. It is purely prohibitory. All it does is prevent employers from hiring any worker whose skill set is less than the minimum wage or substantially less.
to pay their workers more, it would actually save the government money. Now, it's one thing to talk about increasing the minimum wage.
And in fact, no, it's quite the opposite. It would cost the government money because of the additional people on the welfare rolls. If somebody is unemployable by law because they only have a skill set of $7 an hour and the minimum wage is $15 an hour, well, then they're going to go on welfare. So it's going to cost the taxpayer. It's not going to cost the government. The government doesn't have money. It's going to cost the taxpayer money because you imposed this minimum wage and made it impossible for these people to get a job at a wage commensurate with their skill set. And yeah, they'd have to go on welfare and have an even lower standard of living because even $7 an hour is or $6 or whatever is probably paying more than welfare, which doesn't pay very much. And also working a job is a great way to improve your marketable skill set and increase your salary. So you're denying them that opportunity as well. Plus, idle hands are the devil's plaything, right? It's it's good to have a job. It's good to be occupied with your time.
In theory, but what does it actually look like on the ground? To figure that out, we hit the streets of San Francisco, which has one of the highest minimum wages in the country at $15.59 an hour. We talked to a 25-year-old who makes slightly above that at a local supermarket, and the owner of multiple packing and shipping stores who employs minimum wage workers. He's also the president of a local merchants association that was against raising the minimum wage in San Francisco.
If my pay was
Based.
$7.25 now at this point, then it will be
DeBaba Harrison.
very difficult. I would probably be working 7 days a week, 6 days a week, and really having to penny pitch, and really learn how to budget, But now that I'm making a little bit more money, it gives me a little bit, playroom, a little bit time to stretch, but it makes me able to do more things.
The business owner has a slightly different take on raising the minimum wage.
In the worst case scenario, from my opinion, is that if minimum wage goes too high, you're going to see a lot of companies consider other options, eliminating the human. My response to that is I invested in a lot of technology, which reduced a lot of the labor-intensive parts of my business. So I wound up hiring less people, and now I am.
That's why you see these self-checkout kiosks, ordering kiosks at McDonald's. Everything's going to get automated.
Employ a lot less people, and I have more locations. So the net effect is I'm employing less people.
And this brings us to the major argument against raising the federal minimum wage. A lot of people think it'll kill jobs. Think about
That's what it does.
it. Increasing the minimum wage means businesses have to spend more money to pay their employees. And
Not necessarily. Like in the example I gave earlier with the guy making 10 widgets an hour, their labor costs stay the same. They simply choose they choose higher output workers who output more. So they work fewer hours, but they output more and they get paid more. The marginal labor cost stays the same. Obviously, the real world's a little more complicated than that nice widget example, but the tendency is there.
not every business is like Amazon or Apple with endless amounts of money. Many are small mom and pop shops, so they might have to cut back on employee hours or lay people off.
Again, I don't get this cut back on employee hours. I mean, like, it doesn't really make sense how that would work, assuming you keep the labor staff of the same composition, unless there was tremendous slack in the first place. Like, presumably all the workers are there working during the hours they're employed and generating a profit. So it's hard to see how just cutting back on hours is going to help the situation. What you really have to do is reorganize your labor supply so that your marginal labor cost per production unit isn't going up. If you can do that.
Economists have been arguing for decades about whether or not raising the minimum wage kills jobs.
Decades. We've studied the impact of price controls on the markets they govern for thousands of years, since the Roman times.
that a small increase won't. But going from 725 to 15 is not small. It's more than double. A report from the Congressional
Even a small increase is not going to help. It's gonna hurt. It's just going to be invisible.
Budget Office predicts that a $15 minimum wage could force employers to lay off 1.3 million workers. And if your team
And who knows how many they just don't hire on top of that. Forget about workers that are fired. What about the ones that aren't hired?
sorry, but they're usually the first to go because they have the least amount of skills and it's
Which is why a good scientific study on the minimum wage looks at the effect on teenage unemployment, whereas the hacks look at overall unemployment.
just not cost effective to pay them a high wage to essentially learn on the job. If we did increase the minimum wage, some economists worry about what that would do to the economy. With higher wages, many businesses would have to raise their prices to
No, that's not how it works. Prices are set by supply and demand.
pay for it. Over time, that can increase the cost of living, and low-wage workers might be back to square one, where everything's too expensive compared to how much money they're making.
Somehow people thought that, hey, you're going to raise the minimum wage and everyone's going to have more money, but you don't realize that, okay, well, someone's making $10 an hour and
See, this is a really bad argument because if it were true that the minimum wage raised wages and prices went up as a result, they would only go up a small fraction of the wage increase because labor costs are not the only costs involved in producing a product. In fact, they're probably not even that huge relative to other costs. But the minimum wage doesn't increase anybody's wages.
his wage goes up to 15, well, that hamburger that he's been buying for $10 now is probably going to go up to $12 or $13, provided that nothing else goes up other than the minimum wage.
Other businesses might do the opposite. They might do the math, figure they can't afford the higher wages, and just shut down. All right, you've heard the major arguments for
That can definitely happen, especially to some firms that are only marginally profitable and can't find a way to better reorganize their labor supply.
and against raising the minimum wage. There are a lot of potential pluses and potential minuses, and even experts disagree. But what do you think we should do, and why? Let
Abolish the minimum wage.
us know in the comments below. And if you like crunching numbers, check out an episode we did all about universal basic income. And for all you teachers, if you want to bring this topic into the classroom, check us out on our website, KQED Learn. I'm your host, Miles Best. Peace out, blessings, hugs and kisses. I'm going to go finish the rest.
Peace out, bro.